For this particular video, the camera is reversed. So what I'm drawing is actually in reverse of what you will draw. Start your painting off by lightly sketching out the fish with pencil on your canvas. Really notice the negative space around the fish. That is the shape in between the fish and the table. Do you notice how it looks like a V? Do you notice that it looks sort of like a boomerang? If you can get that negative space, you'll better get the shape of your fish. On my palette, I'm going to start with my blue. Okay, so the grayscale tonight, so I wanted you to have the burnt sienna and the blue, and for two reasons, because the blue is going to be cooler and the burnt sienna is going to be warmer. This will be something you'll use for your still life painting that's coming up for your project number 1. Because we're going to have a back and forth between warm and cool on this painting, and my thought process is that when I paint this fish, for example, I want my table surface to be kind of a warmer color, and I want the fish itself to be cooler. My blue, I'm going to start by mixing. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to mix burnt sienna and blue together to give myself, I really like this color in place. Sometimes if you just mix straight black, it tends to be a little bit too cool. So I like these two together because it makes a more interesting, darker tone. So this is going to act as my black here. And then I'm just going to do exactly like what we did with our grayscale, is just start mixing some lighter tones with that, like a 50-50 with white. You see that got pretty light right away. Mix some of that up with a little bit more white. My goal is to sort of keep this paint mixing exercise quick, because we are only allotted 1 hour for this exercise. So if you're out there tonight and you're following along with me, let's just start by mixing a nice palette of some grays, okay? So light, medium, and dark, because we're going to simplify this fish into 3 tones to start with tonight: light, medium, and dark. Okay. And so I've got a nice range of grays right there with that blue. I'm also going to take some just straight black and do some grays with just the black that I have, because this is going to give me a different, my black will give me a different tone of gray. And so we'll just do that because I want to have a nice variety of grays for this painting. We're going to keep it nice and loose tonight, hopefully. I'm going to go back to that blue-brown mixture I did, and I'm going to mix up even, I like a warmer white too. I just want a little bit of a warmer white gray. I know you can't really see what I'm doing here, but if I scoot this over, it's possible that you can see that. No? Yeah, let's scoot this so you can see it up here. All right, so the first thing tonight, to start with this, I'm going to go ahead and flip this back up to my canvas. For this next part, you'll start your underpainting using the ultramarine blue. You'll do your underpainting the same as you did the previous paintings with the burnt sienna. But this time you'll just keep your blue really watery, nice and light, and paint up your values just as you did with the burnt sienna. Go ahead and create a light wash right over your pencil drawing that you drew. Some of your lines might smear, but that's okay. You can keep in mind where your outline was when you start to build up your values. I start by blocking in the fish tail with a darker blue, and I follow the outline of the pencil that I drew in the beginning. Next, I start by blocking in the cast shadow of the fish on the table. I keep it loose, and I don't have any hard edges around the outline of the shadow. Next, I'll start to find the three-dimensional form of the fish. Notice how the end of the tail is moving away from our eye. As the fish curves, the tail goes into shadow. There's a difference between the front of the fish and the back of the fish, and I show this by delineating it with this line right here. Next, I'll start to delineate the top of the fish from the side of the fish by mapping out the different planes. The top of the fish is one plane and the side of the fish is another plane. The side of the fish will be darker than the top of the fish because the top of the fish is getting direct light. The side of the fish I'll paint a little bit darker. I'll also build up my cast shadow to separate the two different values. Next, I'll start to show some of the details of the fish. For example, where are the eyes located? Where does the gill of the fish start? And where do I notice the little side fins? Using that warm white that I mixed up in the beginning, I'll block out the background around the fish. Then I'll take that same white and add a bit of a shade to it, adding a little more blue just to make it darker for that cast shadow. I can go back and forth between adding blue and burnt sienna. I want the shadow to feel cool, but also to have a bit of warmth in it. You can see here that I'm mixing burnt sienna, blue, and white together until I get a nice gradation of grayscale. Then I'll begin by mapping out that cast shadow, starting with the darkest value closer to the body of the fish and bringing out some of the lighter values as it extends away. I do a wet on wet technique and then stitch up and blend to make a soft gradation between the three separate values. Notice that I try to eliminate any hard edges of my fish cast shadow. Next, I'll start to block in the fish in three different distinct values, dark, medium, and light. I'll use dark to start to map in the fish tail and a dark value to map in the side planes of the fish. Then I'll take a medium gray and start to find the gradation between the dark and light areas. I'll add that light to medium gray right into that dark valued area of the fish. I'll start to do the same thing on the back end of the fish tail, working my values from dark to light, always remembering that the top of the fish is getting hit with direct light, so it will be lighter. Next, I'm ready to start painting the top of the fish. This is the third value. This is the brightest value, and I'll start to map that in. Notice that I still think about subtle gradations from light to dark. Oftentimes my paint will be wet, and I'll paint wet on wet as I start to blend these values. As something curves into shadow, there's always small steps of gradation that happens. There's never necessarily a strict cutoff from light to dark. There's usually gentle steps. I'll start to do the same thing on the back end of the fish, keeping in mind where the front of the fish comes forward and curves where the fish starts to curve away from our eye. As the paint is wet, I'll take a dry brush and start to fuzz out those areas, doing a blending technique of wet on wet, but using a dry brush to blend those areas. I like to use this technique a lot when I'm trying to get soft fades. Your brush has to be very dry, and you can't have too much paint, otherwise it'll just blur into a big blob. but if you have just the right amount of paint, you should get a nice subtle blend. I'll use a light gray that I've mixed up to add that cast shadow that's happening on the opposite side of the fish. This will also help my fish feel like it's actually sitting in and on something in space. Notice that I use different sized brushes for different effects and for different areas of the fish. I use skinnier brushes to get into tinier areas and wider brushes to get more flat, bigger areas. I'll continue to work the top part of the fish, and then I'll bring in some of those lighter gray values to find the gill of the fish. I'm measuring the placement by drawing a line vertically from the fish mouth to the fish tail. I can see if I have my eye in the right position and if I have the gill in the right position. This form of measuring is critical to ensure that you have things in proper alignment. I'll start to map out where the fin goes with a light gray, just drawing the outline. I'll keep it really rough. I'll bring in some darker tones along that fin, black and blue, maybe a little blue mixed into the black to find these really strong contrasting values. I want those to be very cool. I'll drag some of that into the occlusion shadow underneath the fish as well. I'll pop in some of those darker values around the eye and pay close attention to the values on the photo reference that I have. Next, I'll come in and try to find the mouth of the fish. Notice that it almost looks like a horseshoe. Pay close attention to the negative space. Don't get tricked by thinking it's a mouth. See it only as shapes. If you look at the fish from the side view, you might actually see the shape of a heart. Using a small brush, I'll start to find the little nuanced details within the mouth. I add just a highlight on top of that dark value to show depth. We're almost finished with our fish, but let's add in the top fins that are much brighter in value. I'll just drag some of that lighter warm color that I mixed up originally and start to map out those fins. Sometimes if I need it to be a bit darker, I'll add a little bit more of the warm burnt sienna and blue. If I have trouble placing these, I can measure the fish again and measure the placement of each item. Notice that I'm using warmer colors in the belly of that fish because from the photo reference, that particular area of the fish is warmer. The back end of the fish feels like a cooler silver, and some of those cooler silver tones also exist towards the front of the mouth. You should start to think about your colors in terms of warm and cool as we move into color. Cooler colors have more blue tones, they are related more to the sky, and warmer colors are related to the sun. Warmer colors tend to advance towards your eyes, they make things feel like they're coming forward, whereas cooler colors tend to feel like they're receding in space. I'll continue to fuss with the tail, covering up some of that dark blue to relate more to the photo reference, bringing in some cooler grays, but letting that underpainting show through to show the depth and the darkness of value. I'll continue to just tweak these little values until I am content with the gradation and the fades. Notice that I'm paying attention to that shift where the fish starts to bend, where the fish starts to turn, and where the fish starts to come forward. Any area where I'm not happy with the value, I'll go back and rework it. In this particular area, I'm adding a cooler gray and dragging it into that darker area. Again, making a softer transition between my light and gray values. I'll keep reworking this particular area of the fish, adding lighter values of gray that are still cool. I don't want it to feel completely black, so I'll mix up some blues that feel sort of more like the silver that's reflected in the fish. The silver, if you were to locate that color, is just really simply a cool blue with a little bit of black. I'll keep dragging that cool gray into the darker values that I've already laid onto the fish. I'll come back into that gill and do the same thing, bringing in some of those silver tones, leaving some of those dark values to show delineation between the eyeball and the gill. It's helpful that those are there because they do create a nice underpainting, and parts of that poking out give my fish a sense of depth. We're getting very close to finishing, so now I'll start to add some of these smaller elements, like that tiny back fin. Maybe I'll add some cast shadows underneath those top fins as well. I'll come back in and brighten any parts that I feel need to be brighter. I'll bring in a brighter white around this fish here on the table to pop it forward. I'll clean up any of the lines that I don't like, tweak any cast shadows that I don't like, and finish any edges. This is the fun part. It's just small tweaking from here. One important thing to remember is that you can never have two values that are the same next to each other. Notice that the value of the white on the table is a little bit warmer than the value on the fish. That slight bit of warmth on the table separates the cool white on the fish mouth and fish head. You need to keep in mind that temperature of your values matters. Just that subtle warmth on the table is enough to separate it from that cool white on the fish head. If they were the same, the fish head and the table would merge together and there would be lack of depth in your painting. And there you have it. You have painted a fish. Great job. We'll see you in class.